The fall of the Steel Belt to the Rust Belt shows a region abandoned by not only industry but government as well. These cities were dependent on industry for their economies, and without a diverse economic output, communities were left in ruin both financially and socially. Those living within the region were working class and faced leaving in search of employment or staying in the Rust Belt and trying to make it by. Most people chose the first, while those who chose the latter see a different life. Where there was once prosperity, communities became riddled with systematic inequality, high unemployment, crime, and drug abuse rates. It was clear that these regions needed help, but little investment from the private and public sectors had made the road to recovery impossible. Industry left the town in search of more growth than profit, and Rockford had to fend for itself. This saw one of the worst periods for Rockford, as records broke for unemployment, crime, homelessness, and more. The after effects picture Rockford as a desolate city, seen for its crime, negative job growth rate, and segregated West Side, which are some of the many symptoms on the rise in the Rust Belt. Rockford is just one of many cities, like Detroit, Michigan, or Gary, Indiana, that was hit hard by deindustrialization. While these cities have tried their best to recover from these events, the recovery has been mixed region-wide, for the same reason why a region fell in the first place. While known as the Rust Belt today, the region was originally called the Steel Belt for the exact opposite reason. The name comes from the region's rise as a booming hub of industry from the 1920s to the 1950s. Whether it was coal, steel, or automotive production, cities in the Steel Belt were home to working class families thriving off the success of manufacturing. Manufacturing was one of America's greatest assets during the time, as World War I and World War II created a great need not only domestically but worldwide. America was one of the only countries not to be physically attacked except for Pearl Harbor in World War II. As every country fell into ruin from the war, America had the chance to rebuild the world from its home. This happened in the Steel Belt, although not exclusively, as the entire country worked to rebuild the world from ruin. The Steel Belt had the opportunity to change lives. Manufacturing was not a skilled labor job, meaning that anyone, regardless of their past experiences, could come to work and have the opportunity to fulfill the American dream. And that is exactly what happened. Through what is known as the Great Migration, millions of people moved from the South, primarily African Americans, for the chance of economic stability. As populations skyrocketed in these areas, local governments struggled to accommodate the rising population. Creating housing for an ever-expanding population leads to housing shortages and even racial disparities in some communities, which is an effect that is still felt in most of the cities throughout the region. My hometown of Rockford had a similar story. Rockford was located in a prime location for manufacturing. Its original Swedish settlers transformed the city into the second largest furniture manufacturing center in the United States in the first half of the 1900s. The city was located on the Chicago Union Railroad, which allowed the goods produced to be easily shipped to Chicago. Additionally, Rockford's location in a highly productive agricultural area shaped a demand for manufacturing agricultural machinery. As time went on, the industry diversified, but still focused on manufacturing. Rockford went from agricultural machinery to machine tools, heavy machinery, automotive products, fasteners, packaging, and in some cases, aerospace. Rockford was an industrial hub, but not as large as other cities like Chicago, which made it suitable for those migrating and in search of economic security away from city life. Rockford was home to many different groups, like Italians, Eastern Europeans, and African Americans who came from the Great Migration. Soon, Latino, Asian, and other ethnic groups would move into Rockford in search of work. After World War II, a post-war boom kicked Rockford's manufacturing into overdrive, and the need for better infrastructure arose, just like it did across the world. In Rockford, it defined the city and split it in half, having an east and west side. The construction of Interstate 90 shifted the balance of these sides. I-90 was opened on the east side of the town, making it more lucrative for the growth and development of the city. The west side did not see this growth and has become the home of the impoverished and also racially segregated. The aftermath of this would not be felt until the fall of the Rust Belt. For a moment, Rockford became the place where anyone could come to work and have a chance to succeed, no matter the origin, level of education, or experience. This was the reality for the entire Steel Belt. But without the manufacturing industry, the economy of these cities would tank. as there was nothing to fall back on. As the Steel Belt continued to grow, its success came from the current need to rebuild. A part of the Truman Doctrine, it was the United States' newfound responsibility to protect the world through military force and, more importantly, economic support. This is why the Steel Belt was so successful. But over time, the East began to rebuild, and at some point, the world would eventually stop relying on the United States for its products and shift to creating its own goods. The Rust Belt began to form in the 1950s, although it was not so easy to identify at the time. A lack of competition within the Rust Belt created a lack of productivity, innovation, and a general stagnation in the region. The Steel Belt dominated since the beginning of the 20th century, as that is when many of these factories and plants opened. As time went on, these factories became older, and the machinery inside became faulty and less efficient. Those who owned the factories could upgrade the machinery, but that would cost a significant amount of money to do so. Since there was no competition, these companies decided not to upgrade and innovate their technology. This led to less wealth being generated in these factories, but with no alternative needed, only impacted the ones working for these manufacturing companies, and many began searching for better work. Another role in the formation of the Rust Belt was the rise of labor unions. Working in manufacturing can be incredibly dangerous, and those who worked in factories were not paid or benefit adequately for their work. All of this led to 1935, when Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, giving power to unions to collectively bargain for their rights. Since the Steel Belt was home to almost all manufacturing, unions in the region held power over companies, as without their work, these companies would fall. Unions all bargained for wage increases through protests and strikes. Those who owned manufacturing companies had to comply with these unions, but it became clear that they did not want to pay their workers and wanted to keep as much wealth as they could for themselves, as increased pay for workers put a strain on the amount of wealth that they could procure year by year. By the 1970s, manufacturing companies had become fed up. As the world finally recovered from the world wars, these companies saw the lucrative business of globalization. While these companies could stay in the Steel Belt, create innovation in their productivity, and pay their workers fairly, these companies could also leave it all behind for higher paying opportunities. By the 1970s, manufacturing companies had become fed up. As the world finally recovered from the world wars, these companies saw the lucrative business of globalization. Globalization is the process in which businesses begin to operate on an international scale. While these companies could stay in the Steel Belt, create innovation in their productivity, and pay their workers fairly, these companies could also leave it all behind for higher paying opportunities. Globalization marked the existence of the Rust Belt. The term Rust Belt comes from a misquotation from presidential candidate Walter Mondale when referring to domestic production moving overseas. As he said, his policies, Ronald Reagan, are turning our industrial Midwest into a Rust Bowl, and I'm not going to let that happen, in response to Ronald Reagan's policy increasing steel imports. Rust Bowl was thought to be Rust Belt, and the name stuck. Mondale believed that America had left its manufacturing companies in favor of other countries' manufacturing. These countries, now rebuilt, did not have the safety nets of unions and did not have an economy to base itself on. Because of this, manufacturing companies could move into a different country for relatively cheap labor with new technologies that were not available in America to boost productivity, all while making workers work for less pay and worse conditions. Asian countries like China, Vietnam, and India were the new manufacturing hubs of the world and left behind the industrial Midwest. Another consequence of the push for cheaper work for the Rust Belt was the migration of manufacturing companies to right-to-work states in the South. While it was not as prominent as moving overseas, it shows how manufacturing companies and private industry generally despise labor unions, as they hold companies liable and ensure that workers are paid fairly for their work. These right-to-work states had laws that made unions weaker, which made it more attractive for private companies in search of more profit. With the rust finally settling, the working class felt the economic strain. When talking about the Rust Belt, Walter Mondale said that the nation's steel industry hasn't gone into a decline, it's gone into a crisis. This crisis is still ongoing, and its effects have drastically changed the very way of life for those who live in the Rust Belt. With history out of the way, what has the Rust Belt left in its wake, and what has changed because of it? In short, these areas were destroyed economically. Factories were abandoned, gaining actual rust, hence the name, and nothing else to lift these economies up. Rust Belt cities primarily focused on manufacturing, and since all of it left the region, cities collapsed, as no wealth was flowing into the cities. It wasn't just manufacturing. 28% of total jobs were lost in the area. This made it increasingly difficult for these communities to even think about recovery, because those living within them had nowhere else to turn to. Working class families didn't have the resources to continue to survive in the Midwest, so they moved in search of better opportunities. You can see this very effectively in electoral college maps, as the area slowly loses votes, while states like Texas, Florida, Georgia, and even California show the migration from Rust Belt states. With fewer citizens, companies to tax, and jobs, a reduction of tax revenue ensued, and public services and infrastructure became increasingly difficult to maintain, leading to dire conditions for these cities. While life was worsening in the Rust Belt, it became more and more difficult to live in the United States. An increasing cost of living from many factors, such as inflation, government policy, imports, etc., generally made it more difficult for Americans to pay their dues. Most Americans began living paycheck to paycheck, which makes it difficult to achieve upward mobility or join the middle class. The American dream is based upon these principles, and is the entire reason why many move to the Rust Belt in search of this opportunity. But without it, the Rust Belt, which was already facing significant challenges, makes it harder for Americans to live. A financial strain is one thing, but a mental strain makes drug abuse and violent crime incredibly likely, and harder to prevent. If you recall, earlier I talked about how the Rust Belt demographics changed because of the Great Migration. Midwestern cities, like Chicago or Detroit, were increasingly popular for those seeking a new life to accrue wealth after the First World War. The Rust Belt was a very popular destination for ethnic minorities. The North did not have as bad of racial tensions as the South did during the time, and those who were uneducated could work in factories to make money to support their families. But without jobs, support of their families, and governments that lacked the funding to support their cities, these settlers and other ethnic minorities were, in a sense, trapped in the Rust Belt. This is not to say that minorities pursued better opportunities, as evidenced by the declining population of the Rust Belt, but they were faced with various challenges that made it hard for them to leave and survive. For example, the Rust Belt is home to cities with the highest black and white segregation in the United States. This made cities split, with sides favoring those with wealth, typically white, educated families, while the other side faced struggles like poverty, which housed majority minority populations, especially African Americans. As such, this modern segregation leads to an unequal opportunity for those in impoverished areas and makes it harder for those to help their families. Poor public services, like education, healthcare, and housing, are examples of the difficulties minorities were subjected to in the Rust Belt. The minority families didn't have the resources to leave in pursuit of the economic stability and had to stay in these areas. Minorities, especially Black Americans, were subjected to worse social services, which led to more instability and depressing opportunities for generations of minority families, who will not be able to pursue more without significant assistance from local governments and increased investment from private companies. The Great Recession exacerbated the struggle individuals in the Rust Belt were already experiencing. The collapse of the housing market was just another piece of struggle piled on to the already great one. Tax dollars became increasingly thin as consumer spending began to decrease and government programs already stressed were being destroyed. More jobs were lost than ever before, and the strain became tighter. The Great Recession is just another period of struggle that was placed upon the residents of the Rust Belt and highlights the desperation of the already desperate region. Economic struggle affects many parts of one's life, and an important one is mental health. Having your life turned around by losing your job, not affording groceries, and sacrificing goods for others can lead to depression and desperation. This leads to an increase in crime, as many face no other option to make a living. Another symptom is increased drug use. For many of those who still had manufacturing jobs, it took a physical toll on those working, and to numb the pain, either physical or mental, some drugs provided that. Particularly, the opioid crisis shows the greatest rise in drug use. The rise of Oxycontin, an opiate, got many hooked, leading to addiction and in some cases, death. For those addicted, many searched for more, like heroin, as they gained a higher tolerance for opioids, and as they began phasing out due to policy, some switched to heroin in its place. Drug abuse has hindered Rust Belt recovery as more become addicted to these opioids and other drugs. My hometown of Rockford has a similar story. Rockford felt the pressure of globalization and stagnation, and as private companies began to deindustrialize in the area and move more overseas, Rockford was abandoned like most major manufacturing cities in the Midwest. Factories seen as staples in the city, like Rockford Watch Company and the Barbara Coleman campus, soon began rusting away. Rockford was based on manufacturing and had to quickly shift its economic focus if the city wanted to survive. To do so, they had to massively cut funding and focus on the city's east side because of Interstate 90's nearby location. Rockford's downtown was essentially abandoned as more people moved to the east side. While the east side was being focused on, Rockford's west side, where a majority of these factories were located, was slowly abandoned just like its factories and faced significant struggle. The west side had also had a minority population and is home to most of the city's poverty and unemployment. With the city of Rockford's focus on the east side, most services provided were weakened, leading to a poor quality of life in terms of housing, infrastructure, and more. In addition to lacking government support, all private companies moved out of the west side, making it increasingly difficult to get things necessary to survive, such as food. This created a food desert, with only recent efforts bringing 2 Aldis to the west side. It was clear to Americans that the Rust Belt was in disarray and in dire need to remove the rust from the region. The Rust Belt needed to be revitalized, but the way is still being debated. For me, recovery so far needs 3 things: government assistance, private investment, and economic and ethnic diversification. To remove the rust from the Rust Belt, federal, state, and local governments have to be committed to their communities and ensure that the livelihoods of all citizens are provided with social services to ensure this, and make sure that this assistance is provided equally, regardless of economic status or race. Local governments are most critical, as they are the ones most familiar with the struggles of Rust Belt families. Public services that can keep all citizens safe, housed, and provided will alleviate the burden placed on them. Governments should also prioritize mental health services to prevent increasing drug use and further support mental health resources for those struggling with said issues. State governments should also further this protection by passing legislation that increases funding for critical programs like infrastructure and education. On the federal level, our government should make sure federal programs help Rust Belt citizens while looking for ways to increase investment in these regions. An example of this is the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, which aimed to increase America's technological output and put it in cities struggling economically, and particularly in the Rust Belt. While transitioning to technology will help bring jobs to the region, it cannot be the only thing that keeps Rust Belt economies alive. Without a diverse economic output, the region would be doomed to repeat its same mistakes. Private investment is the next step. Companies have to return to the Rust Belt and be incentivized to stay there. Without any incentives, investment will happen elsewhere, and where it will benefit these companies the most. To bring these companies back, governments will have to subsidize their returns and benefit those who do to ensure they don't leave. In addition, investment shouldn't be just one type of production. By bringing many facets of goods and services to these cities, if a company decides to leave for whatever reason, it will be less of a blow to the citizens of these cities. It is also important to note that many of these jobs should be available for those without a college degree or specialized training. While these jobs should exist in these areas, A majority of those who remain in these areas do not have the opportunity currently to pursue these paths. The reason the region became prominent in the first place was that anyone who wanted to come to these areas had the opportunity to do so without needing anything other than their passion to work. This will guarantee that people can stay in the region and encourage more to come to the area. This process will take significant time, as companies know how important their presence can be in people's lives. It is important that these companies can provide for those who they employ, by paying them a livable wage and providing benefits that will allow their employees to have an adequate quality of life. It will be important that labor unions are there to protect them without holding too much power that these companies leave the areas once again. To make these economies diverse, it is important to note that the people who make up these workforces should be diverse as well. When rebuilding the Rust Belt, we must cater to all that its downfall has left behind. Although it's a simple concept, when a lot of these cities have been racially segregated because of the abandoned industry, ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to be employed can prove to be more of a challenge. A lot of these cities have tried to revitalize based on these principles, but with mixed results. A city that has had a very prominent recovery is Detroit, Michigan. When manufacturing left Detroit, they were hit worse than most cities in the Rust Belt. A combination of globalization and a higher migration from the city due to white flight, the tax base became incredibly thin. The city was hit so hard that it is one of the few cities in America that has filed for bankruptcy in 2013. When the city filed for bankruptcy, it was assumed that the city was never going to make a recovery. But the city quickly changed its economic output to tourism and technology, while also receiving help from the state government and private investors. The city used its already iconic scenery to make the city worth visiting and a place industry would want to be. While Detroit is the prime example of recovery, Gary, Indiana is the exact opposite. Gary became a hub for industry in Indiana, steel being the city's primary output. The city was, in a sense, created and organized by manufacturing companies. But a combination of strict racial segregation and white flight made the city unsuitable for business, and suddenly, a city built for manufacturing lost its purpose and hasn't been able to find a new one. A staggering 31% of homes are abandoned, a high unemployment rate, and a high violent crime rate show that the city has not been recovered and is only worsening over time. Gary is different from Detroit because where Detroit got assistance from governments and private investment, Gary got nothing. And with no investment, the city cannot be revitalized like Detroit. These two cities showed the need for assistance, as cities cannot do all the heavy lifting themselves. To me, Rockford is one of the cities that has made a comeback, but still has problems that need to be addressed. Rockford has worked to change its economic output for years, and has made vacant buildings a part of this process. Factories, like the Barben Coleman campus I mentioned earlier, are being repurposed into housing and storefronts. While progress has been made, Rockford is still struggling, especially on its west side. Most of the city's unemployment and crime happens there, and has made it especially challenging for minorities trying to make a living. In 2019, the city was named the 8th worst city for Black Americans for having triple the poverty rate of white Americans in the city and nearly half the median income of white Rockfordians. Rockford is on the pathway to recovery, but it still needs more assistance and private investment to avoid further struggle in the city. Removing the rust is a significant challenge that still needs to be addressed. While some cities have been able to make a recovery through the ideas I presented, not every city has received this assistance, which makes it more difficult for cities that face greater struggle than other cities. It will take time and money, but it is still possible to save the region from its struggle. The Rust Belt has been an increasingly important area for presidential elections. Since 2016, 3 states from the region have determined these elections: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. This is significant because for a long time, the states belonged to the presidential candidate who stood for the workers' rights in the regions. It makes sense, as the Rust Belt is home to a majority of working class families. For the longest time, the working class was represented by the Democratic Party in these elections. This is because of the work of President Franklin Roosevelt, who was seen as the most pro-working class president in American history. He created unions, Social Security, and more programs that helped working class families survive, and he even brought manufacturing to the Rust Belt in the first place. FDR single-handedly created working class allegiance, and is the reason why, for decades, it has been the party of the Rust Belt. A term was even coined for its allegiance called the Blue Wall, which was a coalition of states that always voted blue, or Democratic, which included the 3 Rust Belt states I mentioned before, being Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. These places were home to large urban areas that were home to many working class people. They voted Democratic because they believed that they would help bring their homes back to prosperity. However, regardless of the leader, manufacturing investment stagnated, and only little growth could be seen under Democratic leaders. When Donald Trump challenged this narrative, he won the 3 Rust Belt states by saying that Democratic leadership was the reason job loss happened. This is a continuing narrative that has led to consistent Republican wins on the federal level. Republicans have become increasingly popular with working class Americans, which is something that has not been seen since the Reagan administration. The Rust Belt holds considerable power in shaping the federal government. Each presidential election saw numerous rallies in many of these Rust Belt states. Working class families are now more than ever in control of the change they want to see in America, and the disconnect between these Americans and politicians have become even greater. The Rust Belt proves that the American dream was alive in America, yet it also shows how quickly that dream can stay as a dream, not a reality. It is essential for anyone living in these regions to know that you have power. Your vote and ideals can ensure the American dream stays alive, and the Rust Belt can lose its name. Crafting local, state, and federal governments is the tool every person has, and in the Rust Belt has become an even greater tool in making the American dream a reality in the region. Voting is the most extraordinary power for every American citizen, and working class Americans must vote for a government that will fight for them, not the other way around. Government is crucial to rebuilding the Rust Belt, and in the Rust Belt, it is up to them to create the helping hand.